In a system often accused of bending to influence, Judge Johnson was a steel beam that would not sway. As she walked to the bench, her footsteps were unhurried, deliberate. She glanced briefly across the courtroom, her dark eyes scanning the crowd, noting who was present. It was impossible to miss the subtle reactions as she entered. Some people sat up straighter, others averted their gaze entirely. The jurors, as if on cue, locked their attention on her, knowing that every word she would speak carried weight. There was a certain presence about her, the kind that didn't rely on raised voices or grand gestures. It was in the way she stood tall, in the quiet authority she exuded with each measured step. The robe she wore wasn't just a symbol of her position. It was an extension of her history, her struggles, her victories. Growing up, she had faced countless instances where people underestimated her based on her race and gender. Yet here she was, presiding over one of the county's most high-profile cases in years. When she reached the bench, she didn't immediately sit down. Instead, she placed her hands lightly on the polished wood and allowed a moment of silence to settle over the room. That pause was deliberate. It gave everyone a chance to feel the gravity of her arrival. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The entire courtroom stood as Judge Johnson took her seat. Even in that simple motion, sitting down in her chair, there was a sense of finality, as though the day's events were now set in motion. She adjusted the microphone in front of her, glanced at the docket, and then looked up again, this time with a piercing gaze that swept over the defendant's table. On the far side of the room, the two police officers at the center of the controversy sat slouched in their chairs, whispering to each other. If they felt the weight of her presence, they didn't show it. But Judge Johnson noticed everything. The corners of her mouth remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened ever so slightly. In her years on the bench, she had seen every kind of defendant. Nervous, angry, defiant, remorseful. But she could already tell these two were going to be a particular challenge. Her gaze lingered on them for a beat longer before shifting back to the court clerk. Papers rustled as the first case of the day was called, and the stillness in the room was broken by the formalities of court procedure. But beneath the calm exterior, there was already an undercurrent of tension. The case that had drawn such a crowd was unlike the routine matters that usually filled the courthouse calendar. This wasn't a petty theft or a traffic violation. This was about the men sworn to uphold the law, now accused of abusing their power. On paper, the allegations against the two officers, Detective Mark Reynolds and Officer Steve Parker, were precise and damning. They were accused of falsifying arrest reports, using excessive force during a traffic stop, and intimidating witnesses to cover their tracks. But what made the case so explosive wasn't just the list of charges, it was the fact that they had been caught on camera. The footage, grainy yet unmistakable, had already made the rounds on local news and social media. In the video, the officers could be seen detaining a young man with unnecessary aggression, shoving him against a patrol car even as he complied. The sound of one of them making a threat, low but audible, was burned into the public's mind. For weeks, the city had been buzzing with debates about police accountability, and now this courtroom was the epicenter of that storm. The prosecution was prepared with a stack of evidence that included witness statements, internal police reports, and body camera footage, though the latter had been mysteriously incomplete for portions of the incident. The defense, on the other hand, claimed that the officers were acting within their training and had been targeted unfairly because of political pressure. In the front row of the gallery sat community leaders, civil rights advocates, and even a few off-duty officers who had come to show silent support for their colleagues. Some wore subtle pins on their lapels indicating solidarity with law enforcement, while others carried small notebooks, ready to jot down every detail for later discussion. The atmosphere was a strange blend of anticipation and unease, like standing at the edge of a brewing storm. Judge Johnson was fully aware of the stakes. Cases like this didn't just decide the fate of the individuals involved. They set precedents, sent messages, and could shift the fragile balance of public trust in law enforcement. The press coverage alone had been relentless, with headlines designed to spark outrage on both sides. She knew that every decision she made in that courtroom would be scrutinized, dissected, and perhaps even used as fuel for protests or rallies. The court clerk's voice was steady as she read the official case title aloud, the names of the defendants ringing out in the still air. A rustle passed through the spectators. The officers sat side by side at the defense table, wearing tailored suits instead of uniforms. The change in attire did little to soften their presence. They still arose with the same air of authority, the same practiced confidence of men who had been in control for most of their careers. For a moment, Judge Johnson studied their faces. Detective Reynolds, in his mid-40s, had sharp features and a permanent crease between his brows, as though frowning was his default expression. Officer Parker, younger and bulkier, seemed more restless, his knee bouncing under the table. They were both avoiding looking directly at the judge, their eyes instead fixed on some invisible point beyond the bench. The charges had been read, the stakes had been set, and now it was time to see how these officers would conduct themselves under the very system they had sworn to serve. It hadn't gone unnoticed that the defendants were absent when the rest of the courtroom had settled in earlier. Judge Johnson had been ready to begin, but the defense table sat conspicuously empty, save for their attorney shuffling papers with a tight jaw and glancing repeatedly toward the door. Then the side door creaked open, and the two officers walked in as if they had all the time in the world. Not briskly, not with the solemnity that the occasion demanded, but slowly, their steps unhurried. Both wore faint smirks, and a low chuckle passed between them as they entered, like two friends sharing an inside joke. Detective Reynolds gave a quick nod to someone he recognized in the gallery, while Officer Parker let his eyes wander across the room, scanning faces with the casual ease of a man who'd once held the power to stop and question anyone he pleased. Their laughter wasn't loud, but it was just enough to cut through the tension and make several heads turn. The sound, in the context of that courtroom, carried an unmistakable tone, not of nervousness, but of disregard. They didn't seem rushed. They didn't seem embarrassed for arriving after the judge. They didn't even seem to acknowledge that their entrance had interrupted the flow of the proceedings. Instead, they moved toward the defense table with the kind of relaxed swagger that would be out of place for anyone facing serious allegations. The bailiff's eyes narrowed slightly, and a flicker of discomfort passed over the defense attorney's face. He gestured for his clients to sit quickly, but they took their time, placing their phones on the table before finally settling into their chairs. Officer Parker adjusted his suit jacket as though he were preparing for a casual meeting, rather than a hearing that could alter the course of his life. A murmur spread through the gallery. Some spectators shook their heads in disbelief. Others exchanged knowing glances. To them, this wasn't just lateness. It was a performance, a statement that these men weren't intimidated by the courtroom or the charges against them. From her elevated seat, Judge Johnson observed the entire entrance. She didn't interrupt, didn't raise her voice. Her face remained composed, but the set of her jaw tightened ever so slightly. She had seen this kind of behavior before. Defendants who thought their position or past status put them above the rules. But the courtroom was her domain, and in her domain, respect was not optional. The late arrival had already sent a message, whether the officers intended it or not. It hinted at their mindset, at how they viewed the seriousness of the proceedings. And for everyone watching, it planted an unspoken question in the air. If this was how they acted in front of a judge, how did they act when no one was watching? When the two officers finally lowered themselves into their seats, their posture spoke louder than words. Detective Reynolds leaned back in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the backrest, as though he was sitting in his own living room instead of a courtroom filled with people watching his every move. Officer Parker leaned forward, just enough to rest his elbows on the table, clasping his hands loosely, eyes darting around the room, but never in the direction of the bench. It wasn't shyness, and it certainly wasn't respect. It was avoidance, the kind that comes from a deliberate choice not to acknowledge someone's authority. Judge Johnson's eyes lingered on them for a moment, her expression steady, almost unreadable. She was accustomed to nervous defendants who kept their eyes low out of fear or shame. This was different. There was no trace of humility in the way they averted their gaze. Reynolds looked past her toward the back of the gallery, focusing on some indistinct point, as if the judge's presence were irrelevant to him. Parker's attention drifted toward the side wall, where a framed photograph of past judges hung in a neat row, his lips curling slightly in what could only be described as a faint smirk. Neither man seemed to register the tension in the room or the silent expectation that they should meet the judge's gaze, at least as a gesture of acknowledgement. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly aware of how their body language could be perceived. He leaned toward Reynolds, murmuring something under his breath. The detective gave the smallest of nods, but made no change in posture. Parker didn't even glance at his lawyer. A few spectators in the gallery exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and irritation. For those who had come hoping to see accountability, the officer's casual demeanor felt like a slap in the face. For their supporters, it might have been read as confidence or defiance. But either way, it was impossible to miss. Judge Johnson, still watching, adjusted the papers before her with deliberate precision. The weight of her gaze, though unreturned, seemed to settle in the room, like an unspoken warning. She didn't speak yet, but her silence carried a power of its own, as though she were cataloguing each slight, each breach of decorum, and storing it away for the right moment. The clerk continued organizing documents, the sound of shuffling paper a soft counterpoint to the tense quiet that had fallen over the courtroom. The bailiff, ever watchful, kept his eyes on the defendants, his jaw tight. The officer's decision not to look at the judge wasn't just a personal quirk. It was a subtle act of control, an attempt to set the terms of engagement. But in this room, control was not theirs to claim. As if their posture and wandering eyes weren't enough, Officer Parker, the younger of the two, reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a pair of sleek, mirrored sunglasses. Their lawyer's hand shot up each time, trying to rein them in, but the officers seemed almost energized by the disruption, trading quick glances and faint grins, as though they were playing a private game in the middle of a very public trial. Judge Johnson's voice cut cleanly through the layered tension in the room, steady but edged with authority. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. Her tone alone was enough to draw every pair of eyes forward. She looked directly at the officers, her words deliberate, reminding them that in her courtroom speaking out of turn would not be tolerated. The weight behind her statement was heavier than the words themselves, an unspoken warning that patience had limits, and order was not optional. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, turning slightly toward Parker, as if sharing a private joke at the judge's expense. Parker's lips curled into a small, dismissive smile before his eyes drifted upward and rolled in slow exaggeration, visible to anyone paying attention. The gesture was quick, but not quick enough to hide from those in the gallery or from Judge Johnson, whose gaze stayed fixed on them, absorbing every ounce of insolence without a flicker of outward reaction. The sound began small, almost imperceptible, a faint shift of voices, the rustle of clothing, the creak of wooden benches under restless movement. But it spread quickly through the packed courtroom, a low, unsteady ripple of sound that carried an unmistakable charge. It wasn't the casual chatter of bored spectators waiting for something to happen. This was the sound of people reacting, of restrained disbelief and thinly veiled outrage at what they were witnessing. In the front row, a woman in a navy blazer leaned toward the man next to her, whispering sharply under her breath. On the opposite side, a group of young men sat with their arms crossed, eyes fixed on the officers with expressions that hovered somewhere between disgust and grim satisfaction. An older man in a worn leather jacket shifted forward on the bench, his elbows resting on his knees, as though he wanted to catch every single detail. The gallery was a mixed crowd. Supporters of the officers who had come ready to defend their reputation, critics who had been calling for their accountability since the news first broke, and a fair number of curious onlookers who simply wanted to witness the unfolding drama. Now, as the officers' smirks and eye rolls settled into the room like unwelcome smoke, those divisions sharpened. For some, the behavior was proof of what they'd suspected all along, that these men had no respect for authority unless it was their own. For others, it was an uncomfortable moment they tried to explain away, murmuring that it was all being blown out of proportion, that this was just courtroom nerves showing in strange ways. But regardless of interpretation, everyone felt the shift. Even the air seemed thicker, heavier, as though the weight of unspoken words had settled over the room. The bailiff's eyes flicked over the crowd, reading body language the way a trained professional reads a suspect, watching for that one person who might push the moment too far. His posture was straighter now, his stance just slightly wider, grounding himself in case he needed to step in. The murmurs were low, but to Judge Johnson, they were as telling as a shout. They signaled that the room was engaged, alert, and already forming opinions before the first piece of evidence had been formally presented. In her years on the bench, she'd learned that once a courtroom's collective mood shifted like this, it was difficult to pull it back. That knowledge pressed against her mind as she sat silently, letting the sound swell and then subside, controlling the timing of her next move with the precision of a conductor leading a tense symphony. At the prosecution's table, the lead attorney's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the defendants, with a focus that was almost surgical. He knew this behavior could work in his favor if the jury saw it as arrogance. At the defense table, the attorney for the officer scribbled something on a legal pad, sliding it toward Reynolds without looking up. Reynolds read it, gave the faintest shrug, and pushed it aside. Parker didn't even glance at it, his attention still drifting to something on the far wall as if the entire room were nothing more than background noise. The sound in the gallery finally began to thin, settling back into uneasy silence, but that silence felt sharper now, like glass underfoot. No one could pretend the moment hadn't happened. No one could unsee the smirks, the eye rolls, the subtle postures that spoke of defiance more loudly than any words could. The courtroom might have been quiet again, but the tension was now firmly lodged in the air, thick and unyielding. The defense attorney leaned forward, his elbows pressing into the polished wood of the table, his voice low but urgent as he addressed his clients. To anyone watching from the gallery, it was obvious that his tone was meant to rein them in, to remind them of the stakes. He spoke quickly, the words meant for their ears only, his gaze darting briefly toward the bench to ensure the judge wasn't already preparing to step in. Reynolds didn't even turn his head fully toward him. His eyes remained forward, his chin tilted slightly upward, and the only acknowledgement he gave was a barely perceptible flicker of a smile, one that seemed more amused than compliant. Parker, meanwhile, shifted in his seat, leaning back as though to physically put more space between himself and the attorney's whispered instructions. His expression was blank, almost bored, his gaze fixed on some indeterminate spot ahead, as if the conversation wasn't worth his attention. The attorney's frustration was clear in the way his hand tightened around his pen, tapping it once against the table before forcing himself to still it. He adjusted his tie, leaning in again. This time, speaking with even more intensity. It was the kind of urgency that came from knowing that every small action, or inaction, was being documented in the minds of the judge, the jury, and the press seated just outside the frame of the moment. Still, his words landed like stones on water, causing a slight ripple but ultimately sinking without effect. The officers maintained their postures, refusing to match his energy or even offer the bare minimum of acknowledgement. It was as though they had silently decided that he might be their legal representative, but he was not their authority. In the gallery, this dynamic did not go unnoticed. A young woman near the back leaned toward her friend, whispering. They're not even listening to him. An older man, closer to the front, exhaled heavily, shaking his head in slow disbelief. The tension that had begun to simmer during the earlier exchange was now taking on a new shape, less about the disrespect toward the prosecutor, and more about the growing sense that the defense team itself wasn't in full control of its clients. The prosecutor, though outwardly composed, allowed the faintest twitch of satisfaction to cross his features before smoothing it away. If the defendants were willing to ignore their own counsel in open court, that lack of discipline could play into his hands later. Jurors notice things like that. Judges do too. Judge Johnson observed the interaction from the bench, her eyes sharp but her face unreadable. She didn't interrupt yet. There was no need. She understood the value of letting a dynamic reveal itself fully before stepping in. Sometimes the most powerful thing a judge could do was simply watch, letting the silence grow until it became a mirror in which people reveal their true selves. The defense attorney finally leaned back, drawing in a slow breath and adjusting the stack of papers before him, as though to refocus his energy on the legal battle ahead. But the brief moment of negotiation between him and his clients had already left its mark. For those watching closely, it was a moment that told more about the defendant's attitude than any piece of testimony could. It happened so quickly that for a moment, the sound seemed to hang in the air, as if the room itself wasn't quite sure it had heard correctly. The prosecutor had paused to gather his next statement, and Judge Johnson had turned her attention toward the defense table, ready to address a procedural point. That's when Reynolds leaned forward, his voice carrying clearly across the microphone in front of him. "Well, lady, that's not exactly how it went," he said, the words sliding out of his mouth with a casualness that didn't belong in a courtroom, much less when directed toward the bench. There was no trace of deference in his tone, no attempt to soften the impact. Instead, it had that particular edge, the one laced with condescension, as if the formality of titles was an inconvenience he couldn't be bothered to uphold. The syllables hit differently here. In the rigid framework of a court, where your honor is not just custom, but an acknowledgement of the authority vested in the judge, stripping away the title was an act that bordered on provocation. Reynolds didn't lean back afterward, didn't glance toward his attorney to gauge his reaction. He simply stayed forward in his seat, looking as if he had said something perfectly reasonable. The gallery's reaction was immediate, if hushed. A young man in the back blinked hard, as if replaying the sound in his head. The woman in the navy blazer from earlier pressed her lips together, her expression tightening in disapproval. Across the aisle, one of the officer's supporters shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the floor. Even those who might have defended the officers up to this point couldn't deny that the choice of words was an open break from decorum. Parker, seated beside Reynolds, let out a quiet chuckle, not loud enough to be a laugh, but just enough to signal his amusement to his partner. He kept his eyes low, but his grin betrayed the satisfaction of seeing a line crossed in such a public way. Their attorney's face, however, told a different story. He froze mid-note, pen hovering above the paper, his jaw visibly clenching before he set the pen down altogether. Without looking at them, he drew in a slow breath, the kind that carried equal parts frustration and resignation. The prosecutor didn't speak. He didn't need to. This was a moment between the judge and the defendant, and everyone in the room knew it. Eyes shifted toward the bench, waiting to see what form the response would take. Judge Johnson remained still for a beat longer than expected, her gaze fixed squarely on Reynolds. There was no rush in her movements as she leaned back slightly in her chair, fingers interlacing atop the desk in front of her. She didn't have to say a word for it to be clear that she had heard him perfectly. The silence that followed was deliberate, measured, and it spread like a slow ripple through the courtroom, pressing against the edges of the room until even the fidgeting in the gallery stilled. The pause stretched long enough for the tension to become palpable, for the reality of the moment to settle on every person present. No one was mistaking this for a slip of the tongue or a simple oversight. It was intentional, and it had landed exactly as the speaker intended. The sound came all at once, a sharp intake of collective breath that cut through the charged quiet like a sudden gust of wind. It wasn't polite or restrained. It was raw, unfiltered reaction, the kind that slipped out before people could decide to hold it in. Some gasps were small, quick, barely audible, while others came louder, echoing faintly off the wood-paneled walls. It was as if the audience had been holding their composure up until that moment. carefully balancing between curiosity and respect, only for the balance to snap under the weight of that single word. The decorum of the courtroom cracked for just an instant, replaced by the unguarded response of a crowd witnessing something they knew was far outside the bounds of normal conduct. In the second row, a man with a neatly trimmed beard actually leaned back in his seat, eyebrows raised as though needing physical distance from the words he'd just heard. A woman near the back pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes wide, her breath escaping in a slow shake of her head. Even among the officer's supporters, the reaction was impossible to hide. Slight shifts in posture, subtle tightening of shoulders, the kind of reflexive response people have when they know a line has been crossed too visibly to ignore. Brr. The gasps weren't just a reaction to the break in courtroom etiquette. They carried the weight of the larger moment, the context of who was speaking and to whom. This wasn't any defendant speaking to any judge. This was a white police officer addressing a black female judge in one of the most high-profile cases the county had seen in years. The layers of power, history, and perception made the word "a lady" ring louder than it ever could have in isolation. The bailiff's head turned slightly toward the gallery, his presence reminding everyone that while reactions might be involuntary, order was still expected. The murmurs that followed the gasps were quickly silenced under his steady gaze, but the energy in the room had shifted again, sharper now, more brittle. Parker seemed almost to enjoy the sound, his smirk deepening just slightly, while Reynolds kept his face neutral, as if the reaction was nothing more than background noise. Their attorney, however, finally broke his stillness, leaning in toward them, his voice low and urgent, his words quick but impossible to hear over the residual hum of the room. Judge Johnson hadn't moved yet, but the stillness of her form had changed in quality. It was no longer the quiet observation of earlier. It was the kind of stillness that comes just before action, the measured calm of someone deciding exactly how to respond in a way that would carry the most weight. The audience, for their part, seemed to hold their collective breath again, waiting, the earlier gasp still echoing faintly in memory, its reverberation stitched into the fabric of the morning. The courtroom felt as if it had stopped breathing. Judge Johnson's eyes locked on Reynolds, not in anger, but in a steady, unwavering way that seemed to strip away the noise around them. Her expression didn't shift. She didn't frown, didn't raise her eyebrows, didn't show the slightest hint of a smile. It was the kind of look that didn't need volume to command attention. It spoke of control, of patience honed over years, of knowing exactly when to move and when to hold still. Her hands rested lightly on the bench, fingers interlaced, as if anchoring herself in the moment. The overhead lights cast a soft glow across her features, highlighting the calm precision in her posture. To the casual observer, it might have looked like nothing at all, but to those who understood courtroom dynamics, it was the equivalent of a measured inhale before a deliberate step forward. She let the seconds pass, each one stretching a little longer than was comfortable. In those beats of silence, the courtroom's earlier gasp still seemed to hum in the air. The faint shuffling from the gallery quieted completely. Even the bailiff, who normally stood like a fixed part of the room, seemed more rigid, his focus locked not on the crowd, but on the silent exchange at the center of the room. Reynolds, perhaps realizing he had become the sole focus of her attention, shifted slightly in his seat. It wasn't an apology, not even close, but a subtle tightening of his shoulders, as if to brace for what might come. Parker, sitting beside him, kept his eyes fixed forward, though the corner of his mouth betrayed the faintest flicker of amusement. Like someone watching a scene, he thought he already knew the ending to. The pause wasn't just about silence. It was about giving the weight of the moment room to settle on everyone in the room. Judge Johnson had learned long ago that sometimes the absence of speech carried more authority than a raised voice. Here in this crowded space, she wielded that silence like a finely sharpened tool. When she finally spoke, her voice was even and controlled, tone stripped of any unnecessary inflection. It wasn't the sharp bark of reprimand some might have expected. Instead, it was something quieter, but far more dangerous, precise, deliberate, and completely devoid of emotion. "Detective Reynolds," she said, the formal use of his title carrying its own gravity. "Would you repeat what you just said?" The words seemed to land heavier than they should have, each syllable measured and clear. It was not a request for clarification in the ordinary sense. It was an invitation for him to place his words on the record with full awareness of their weight. The question didn't need to be loud. It cut straight through the stillness and landed in the space between them like a challenge wrapped in politeness. Reynolds' eyes flicked briefly toward his attorney, an almost instinctive glance, in search of a cue. His lawyer's jaw was tight, his gaze locked forward, offering no comfort. The pause stretched just long enough to draw attention before Reynolds leaned back slightly in his chair. His expression was unreadable, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as if deciding whether to temper his words or double down. In the gallery, the silence was brittle. Every person there understood the layers beneath her question. This wasn't just about the literal repetition of a phrase. It was about intent, about forcing him to make a choice in front of everyone watching. Would he soften his language, framing it as a misunderstanding? Or would he commit fully to the casual disrespect he had already displayed? Parker tilted his head slightly toward Reynolds, the movement subtle but noticeable, a silent nudge that might have been encouragement. His smirk returned, faint but deliberate, the kind of expression meant to be seen by only one person, but ending up visible to anyone paying close attention. Reynolds' lips parted, the faintest shift of air escaping as if testing the shape of the words before committing to them. The tension in the room coiled tighter with each fraction of a second that passed. The weight of Judge Johnson's gaze didn't waver, holding him in place as though the rest of the courtroom had faded into shadow, leaving only the two of them in focus. Her posture remained unchanged, her hands still folded before her, her expression an unmoving mask of composure. The request had been simple, but in the deliberate calm of her delivery, it carried more force than if she had slammed her gavel. It was the kind of calm that dared him to make his next move very carefully. Her body shifted just enough to close the space between her and the defendants, the movement subtle but unmistakable. She placed her forearms on the bench, leaning in so her voice would carry with deliberate clarity. Her eyes locked on theirs, stripping away any chance of pretending they weren't the center of the moment. Her tone remained calm, but each word landed with precision. She spoke of the day they'd sworn to serve and protect, the weight of that promise, and the expectation that their conduct, both in uniform and out, should reflect the trust placed in them. Judge Johnson's voice shifted, not in volume, but in the precise way she shaped each syllable, making certain there was no possibility of misunderstanding. She spoke slowly, her tone steady, as she outlined exactly what had unfolded since their arrival. She began with the late entry, the casual stride into the courtroom after the session had already been called to order, noting the laughter they carried with them, like an unwanted echo. She described how they had avoided eye contact, a gesture which, while subtle, spoke volumes about their attitude toward the bench and the process unfolding before them. She mentioned the sunglasses, how they had been worn indoors, in a place where every defendant knew the importance of respect and visibility, and how removing them only came after a delay, as though it were a favor rather than an expectation. She spoke of the repeated interruptions, each one breaking the rhythm of the prosecution's case, each one serving no real purpose other than to derail the proceedings. Her voice was calm, but the cadence carried the weight of a record being read into history, each detail crisp, undeniable, and unsoftened by opinion. Then she moved to the moment that had broken the already fragile decorum entirely, the use of the word "a lady" in place of "your honor." She didn't raise her voice when she recounted it. She didn't need to. The gallery knew the moment well, and its sting lingered without embellishment. She simply placed it in the sequence of behaviors, allowing it to rest there, framed by everything that had come before and everything that had followed. Her gaze didn't shift from them, but her words weren't only for their ears. They were for the jury, for the gallery, for the record. She wanted it clear that what she had witnessed wasn't a single lapse, but a pattern, a series of deliberate choices that spoke of a deeper issue than momentary frustration. She described it as a blatant disregard for courtroom protocol, the kind of conduct that undermined the very system they were now part of, not as officers of the law, but as defendants facing it. The room was utterly still. Even the smallest movements, someone adjusting their seat, a pen rolling across a desk, were avoided as though they might disrupt the gravity of her words. The bailiff's eyes moved from the judge to the defendants. His stance firmer now, shoulders squared, prepared for whatever turn the moment might take. Parker leaned back slightly in his chair, his jaw shifting as if he were grinding his teeth. But he kept his expression otherwise flat. Reynolds held her gaze, though his eyes flickered with the briefest hints of something, restlessness, irritation, calculation, before returning to a mask of control. Their attorney sat motionless beside them, his hands folded on the table, his breathing slow, as though bracing himself for what might come next. Judge Johnson didn't hurry. She allowed each observation to settle in the air before moving on to the next, ensuring that there was no mistaking the depth of her awareness. Her role wasn't to vent anger, but to create a record, an unshakable sequence of events that no one could rewrite later. By the time she reached the end of her summary, the tension in the courtroom had thickened into something almost tangible, a shared awareness that the morning's proceedings had shifted far beyond a standard hearing. After a pause that felt longer than it truly was, Judge Johnson adjusted her position, straightening fully in her chair. Her voice, still calm, but now edged with unmistakable command, broke the silence. Detective Reynolds, Officer Parker, stand. The words carried no rise in volume, yet they moved through the courtroom like a command carved in stone. There was no mistaking it as a suggestion, no room for negotiation. Her tone had the weight of absolute authority, the kind that came not only from her position, but from the certainty with which she wielded it. The officers hesitated. Not long, but long enough for the hesitation itself to register. Parker glanced sideways at Reynolds, who didn't look at him, but slowly pushed back his chair. The sound of the chair legs scraping against the floor was louder than it should have been, sharp in the stillness. Parker followed, rising a beat later, his movements slower, almost reluctant. Now standing, they seemed taller, but also somehow more exposed. The casual slouches and lazy postures they had worn while seated no longer shielded them. Their hands rested stiffly at their sides, and while Reynolds kept his chin up, Parker's gaze drifted toward the far wall, avoiding her eyes, entirely avoiding her eyes. The gallery watched in silence, some leaning forward slightly, as if they might catch something subtle in the shift of body language. The defense attorney remained seated, his hands now pressed flat against the table, his eyes forward. If he had advice to give, it would have to wait. Judge Johnson let the moment stretch, the visual of the two officers standing before her solidifying in the minds of everyone present. When she spoke again, her tone had the measured precision of someone who understood the effect of each word. She addressed them directly, speaking not only to their actions in the courtroom, but to the deeper implications of their conduct, both here and in the context of their sworn duties as law enforcement officers. Her words moved between the personal and the institutional. She reminded them that standing was not merely a physical posture, but a sign of acknowledgement, a recognition of the authority of the court and the process they were part of. She spoke of the symbolism behind such act, how small gestures carried meaning in the eyes of the public, the jury, and the law itself. The officers stood motionless, but the tension in their shoulders betrayed the effort it took to remain still under her gaze. Reynolds' jaw was set, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that could have been defiance or simply the discipline of holding his ground. Parker shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, his hands curling briefly into loose fists before relaxing again. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried more force than if she had shouted. In that moment, the physical arrangement of the room, the elevated bench, the defendant standing before it, the gallery seated in silent observation, felt sharper, more defiant. The power dynamic, already present in every courtroom, was now impossible to ignore. The bailiff's presence seemed to grow more pronounced, his focus entirely on the two men in front of the bench, his stance ready but neutral. The jurors, if they had been drifting in their attention at any point earlier, were fully engaged now, their eyes tracking every movement, every shift in tone, every flicker of expression between judge and defendants. Judge Johnson's decision to have them stand wasn't merely procedural, it was symbolic, a deliberate reclaiming of the respect that had been eroded through their earlier behavior. In making them rise, she wasn't just addressing the events of the morning, she was resetting the terms of engagement for the rest of the proceedings. The act itself was simple, almost mundane in isolation. But here, layered atop the morning's events, it carried a weight that everyone in the room could feel. Judge Johnson's eyes remained fixed on the two officers, the weight of her attention holding them in place more firmly than any physical restraint could. When she began to speak, her tone was deliberate, each word chosen with the care of someone who knew the value of precision. In moments like this, she didn't rush. Instead, she built her words slowly, layer by layer, ensuring that the message was not only heard but absorbed. She spoke first of the courtroom itself, not as a mere physical space, but as a cornerstone of the judicial system. She described it as a place where truth was pursued, where the rule of law was upheld, and where every individual, regardless of their position or profession, was bound by the same standards of conduct. Her voice carried no unnecessary flourish, yet the simplicity of her delivery made the gravity of her words all the more striking. She reminded them that respect in this setting wasn't about personal admiration for the individuals in it. It was about respect for the process, for the principles that governed it, and for the centuries of precedent that had shaped its existence. She spoke of how even the smallest breaches in decorum chipped away at the foundation of that system, how a smirk or an eye roll might seem insignificant in isolation, but could erode the credibility of the proceedings when witnessed by others. Her gaze moved between Reynolds and Parker, never lingering on one for too long, making it clear that her words were meant equally for both. She acknowledged their service as officers, the long hours and difficult situations they had no doubt faced in their careers. But she also made it clear that with that service came a deeper obligation to embody the values they swore to protect, not only on the streets, but within the walls of the court. The gallery was silent, every ear tuned to her voice. Even the officer's attorney seemed unusually still, his eyes forward, but his focus clearly on the message being delivered. Her lecture was firm, but it wasn't fueled by anger. It was the voice of someone who believed in the integrity of the system and refused to let it be diminished, no matter who stood before her. She spoke of the symbolic weight carried by those in uniform, how their actions were scrutinized, not just for legality, but for example. She told them that when they showed contempt for the process, whether through words, gestures, or posture, they didn't just disrespect her, they disrespected the public trust. The transition in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. The measured cadence of her lecture shifted, carrying a sharper edge now. The warmth of explanation gave way to the steel of consequence, the unspoken promise that patience had its boundaries. She explained what contempt of court was. Not in the abstract, but in concrete terms they could not misinterpret. She detailed how it could apply not only to overt acts of disruption, but also to patterns of behavior that undermine the dignity and authority of the court. She outlined the potential repercussions: fines, jail time, the immediate removal from the courtroom. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in emphasis, as she reminded them that she was well within her rights to enforce those measures at any moment, should their conduct warrant it. The phrasing left no ambiguity. This was not a hypothetical scenario or a distant possibility. It was a line drawn directly in front of them, one that they were already dangerously close to crossing. She made it clear that the courtroom was not a place for personal rivalries, silent games, or shows of defiance. Every person present, from the attorneys to the jury to the gallery, was entitled to a fair and orderly process. When that order was compromised, especially by those who should understand its importance better than anyone, It was her duty to act swiftly and decisively. The air in the room felt heavier, the silence between her words, pressing in from all sides. Reynolds' posture stiffened, his chin lifting just slightly, while Parker shifted his weight but kept his eyes trained forward. The defense attorney's lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers tapping lightly against the table, as though weighing whether to intervene. Judge Johnson didn't fill the space with unnecessary commentary. She let the warning stand on its own, its clarity amplified by the absence of anything to soften it. The message was plain. The choice was theirs. But so were the consequences, and she would not hesitate to act. Judge Johnson's voice carried through the courtroom with a steady resonance, each word deliberate and grounded in conviction. She spoke of the law as a shield meant to protect all citizens equally, without regard to race, rank, or position. Her gaze swept the room, making certain no one mistook her meaning. She reminded everyone present that justice was not a privilege granted to the few, but a right owed to all, and that those entrusted with enforcing the law must be held to its highest standards. Her tone shifted from principled to resolute. The authority, in her words, undeniable. She outlined the violations that had been proven, citing specific breaches of duty and ethical failures. With clarity and firmness, she announced the disciplinary actions that would follow, ensuring the record reflected both the wrongdoing and the court's commitment to accountability. The moment the judge's ruling was spoken, a wave of reaction swept through the room. From the gallery, gasps and murmurs rose almost at once, some voices carrying an edge of disbelief, while others held the warmth of vindication. A few people exchanged glances that seemed to say they hadn't expected such a decisive stand, while others allowed the corners of their mouths to lift in quiet satisfaction. The atmosphere seemed to pulse between tension and release, a charged energy born of months, perhaps years, of frustration finally finding a point of recognition. Near the back, an older man in a dark coat clasped his hands together tightly, his shoulders rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. A woman in the front row dabbed at the corner of her eye, the emotion in her expression clear even without words. On the opposite side, a pair of uniformed officers stiffened, their gazes fixed forward, as if to avoid meeting the eyes of anyone else in the room. The sound of movement, shifting feet, the scrape of chairs, the rustle of clothing, filled the brief silence between reactions, underscoring just how deeply the judge's words had landed. Even the jurors, who had been instructed to remain composed, showed flickers of response. A few nodded almost imperceptibly, while others sat back in their seats, the tension in their posture loosening for the first time that day. The energy in the space was no longer uniform. It moved like ripples in water, spreading from the bench outward, touching each person in a different way. By the time the heavy wooden doors swung open and people began stepping into the daylight, word of the verdict and the judge's statement had already started to travel. Phones were lifted in every direction, some recording quick recaps, others dialing numbers to share the news with voices on the other end. Reporters clustered near the steps, microphones ready, their questions sharp and eager, hoping to catch raw reactions while emotions still ran high. Across the plaza, conversations overlapped in a chaotic but purposeful rhythm. Some spoke in urgent tones, repeating the judge's exact words to friends who hadn't been inside. Others framed the moment in broader terms, calling it a turning point, a rare and needed example of accountability. A few doubters voiced skepticism, wondering aloud if the change would last, but their voices were quickly met by others who insisted that this moment mattered, if only for what it represented. Within minutes, snippets of video from inside the courtroom began appearing on social media. Clips of the judge's statement were shared, captioned, and reposted, drawing comments from people far beyond the city. Hashtags formed, trending within the hour, as the story sparked debates, celebrations, and calls for wider reform. By evening, it wasn't just a local headline. It had reached national coverage, the image of Judge Johnson standing firm in her robes, appearing on television screens across the country. In the crowd outside, the air was thick with both relief and urgency. Strangers exchanged words as though they'd known each other for years, bound together by a shared witness to what had happened inside. Every voice, every camera, every hurried text seemed to carry the same underlying current, that something had shifted, and the world beyond these courthouse steps needed to hear it. And that, dear listeners, is why moments like this aren't just court decisions. They're lightning strikes in the dark, flashes that show us exactly where we stand and where we need to go. The courage to speak truth, the will to act on it, and the ripple it sends through the world. That's the heart of every story we tell here. You've been riding shotgun with A1 Storyteller, where real events meet the kind of twists and turns you can feel in your bones. If this story lit a fire in you, if it made you gasp, cheer, or even clench your fists, then carry that energy forward. Share it. Talk about it. Keep the conversation alive, because that's how change doesn't just happen once. It keeps on happening. Until our next chapter, remember, truth doesn't whisper, it roars, and we'll be right here to make sure you hear it.